Good afternoon and welcome to this Daily Maverick webinar. It's wonderful to see so many of you with us already, and I'm sure we'll have more joining us as we go along. Let me start by thanking Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for their generous sponsorship of this webinar, and also to tell all you wonderful viewers that if you are to purchase Rehana's book in the course of this webinar, you can do so for, let me just check this, I think it is 290 Rand, absolute bargain, 290 Rand for this wonderful book with free delivery anywhere in South Africa. There is a link in the chat function on the right, so please do make use of that wonderful offer. Rehana Rossouw, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Rehana is, of course, one of South Africa's most well-respected journalists, editors, and writers, and she has written the book which we are discussing today, Predator Politics. Rehana, do you have a copy of the book there? I'm afraid I had an electronic version, so I can't show people the cover.
Can I dart away from the screen for 1 second?
Please do.
So just out of arm's length. Okay,
so
just out of arm's length.
I want people to be able to recognize it at a glance when they go into their local bookshops.
Thank you.
There we go. Predator Politics, Mabuza, Fred Daniels, and the Great Land Scam by Rehana Rossouw. That is the book we're discussing today. I was just telling Rehana before we went live that I cannot recall a book in recent years that has viscerally enraged me as much as Rehana's did. It is just so angering on so many levels, which is not to take away from what a really compelling read it is as well, and a fantastic work of journalism. In short, it's the story of one man trying to establish a conservation and tourism project in Mpumalanga, one which would have brought, we assume, untold benefits to the region, and being thwarted at every turn by corrupt politicians and by private sector enablers. And I can't wait to unpack that further with Rehana. But Rehana, could you tell us first, how did you get interested in this story in particular?
I ended my journalism career 2 years ago, and my publisher pounced on me and said that she had been approached by Fred Daniel, who had come to see her about what had happened to him. He had a 1 billion rand damages court case against government officials, government departments, and the former premier of Mpumalanga and the current deputy president of South Africa, Didi Mabuza, who was one of the defendants in his case. The damages case had been set down for July and August this year. It was postponed, but the book was coincided to come out as the trial got underway.
I see. Now, prior to this, had you any knowledge of Fred Daniels' story?
I had my last job in journalism was at Business Day, and at the time that Fred approached the Constitutional Court for assistance in establishing a commission of inquiry into corruption in Mpumalanga, Business Day had covered the issue, and I had in fact edited the stories about Fred that was published in the newspapers. So I had no idea how long he had been fighting for, but I knew about him.
So before we get into the nitty-gritties of his story in particular, can you just help us understand the context a little more in terms of Mpumalanga itself? Here's this very small, relatively insignificant province, which seems so extraordinarily corrupt, even by South Africa's standards. How is it that it has become this kind of epicenter, ground zero for corruption?
Well, one of the major issues has been the cooperation between former Kangwane homeland officials and ANC people in 1994, in 1995, when we established a democratic government. A lot of officials from the former Kangwane were brought into the Mpumalanga government, and they basically just ran scams that they had already started in the homeland. One of the biggest scandals in Mpumalanga, one of the first ones, involved the granting of land in Kangwane to former officials. It was just gifted to them, they said, for their public service. I don't know what Kangwane ever did for its so-called citizens, but they basically seamlessly carried their scams from the homeland into the democratic government.
I also like the, you quote political scientist Tom Lodge, I think, is saying that what has contributed to Mpumalanga's current issues is this mishmash of political cultures, where you have the ANC bringing its own systems and then the old homelands bosses who demand kind of deference and privilege as part of their legacy, I suppose, as part of their ongoing political culture.
And look, I mean, the homelands were basically an opportunity to, strip Black South Africans of their citizenship. I think that was the major political project. But then once they were stripped of their citizenship, I mean, the homelands basically, it was a system of graft. Homeland residents had to pay government officials for every single administrative function that they were charged with performing. I mean, the homelands, I don't think we've ever gotten to the bottom of the extent of homeland corruption. Tom Lodge does a very, very good job, I think, in looking particularly at the corruption creep from the homelands into Mpumalanga. But the same would have been true for Transkei and Ciskei. You look today at the problems in the Eastern Cape, and I think a lot of those problems stem from the way in which Ciskei and Transkei were established and how they basically were corrupt administrations.
And also an under-acknowledged fact that one of the reasons the Western Cape does so well comparatively is because it didn't have any of those homelands to incorporate.
Exactly. Not only did it not have those homelands, but it also had it had laws to keep African citizens out of the province. So, anyway, let's me not start on the Western Cape. I live here now, so...
Okay, before we get to Fred Daniel, so you write in the book that the template for what happened to Fred was a 25 billion rand corruption scheme in the mid-1990s called the Dolphin Deal. And you and I were just saying off camera the kind of amnesia we all have when it comes to corruption, because there's just such a volume of it that we tend to forget these things as the years pass. Can you just sketch for us what happened with the Dolphin Deal? Because it does kind of provide the template for what happened here.
Okay, so South Africa's game parks, nature reserves, and conservation assets across the country belong to the public in terms of the Constitution, in terms of all our conservation laws. They are administered by provincial governments on behalf of the people of South Africa. However, in Mpumalanga, when the provincial government was established in democracy, a former homeland official called Alan Gray, who had been a consultant to the Minister of Environment Affairs, or whatever he was called, in the Kangwane homeland, brought a scheme to privatize the state-owned and the state-administered conservation assets. So what they did, without consulting anybody, without due diligence, they decided that they would get a management deal with a company which ostensibly was based in Kenya, but turned out was based in Dubai, to manage the parks on behalf of the Mpumalanga government. And basically what they did then was ensure that a whole lot of all of the money that was intended for conservation in the province was gifted to this company that was situated in Dubai and had already been involved in huge corruption in Kenya. They had some, I suppose, experience in running game reserves. They had been involved in the Masai Mara in Kenya. But yeah, I mean, this unfolded over a period of 4 years. Justin Orenstein, who was a brilliant reporter based in Nelspruit, who had started African Eye News Agency, covered the scandal in meticulous detail. Nobody was ever prosecuted in South Africa, really, except for one low-ranking official who got a 10-year sentence for fraud. None of the politicians involved were prosecuted. And yet in a UK court, the Kenyan businessman behind the scheme went to jail. The British newspapers called him King Con. King Con. So King Con came to South Africa and managed to defraud the Parks Board in Mpumalanga out of millions of rands. And the consequences for conservation have been shocking. Conservation in Mpumalanga has never recovered from this.
I think that's such an important kind of takeaway of your book that I really want to look into later, which is that we often assume that corruption, graft, state capture has its impact most severely on the poor in terms of service delivery. But what your book makes so clear is that the effects for conservation, for the environment, can be just catastrophic. But let me not jump into that now. Let's talk a bit about Fred Daniel. Can you tell us a bit about who he is and what his vision was for what he wanted to do in Mpumalanga?
So Fred was a businessman in the new South Africa. He was wholeheartedly supportive of democracy in South Africa. He was wholeheartedly supporting building better lives for Black citizens. He ran a software company, sold it for a lot of money in the early 90s and decided to invest in a conservation project somewhere in Southern Africa. Fred had always been interested in the environment. He had been inspired by a teacher when he was a young student in primary school, a teacher who had suggested that the planet didn't have enough resources to support the growing population. Always been interested in conservation, decided that he would invest all of his millions in the late 90s in a conservation project in South Africa. He looked all over, he looked for years to find the right piece of land to buy, guided by some of the best conservation experts in the country. And then he finally found this farm in Mpumalanga, which was for sale, which had a river running through it, which was ringed by mountains. The Barberton Mountain Lands is one of the most beautiful places in South Africa and had high rates of unemployment. And what Fred wanted to do was establish a conservation project and create jobs in southern Mpumalanga, an area that was suffering because asbestos mines were the major employers. The asbestos mines were closing. The land had to be rehabilitated. Fred worked painstakingly to rehabilitate land which had been virtually destroyed by mining and by poor farming methods. And he wanted to build this for all citizens of South Africa. His dream was to heal the land and then donate it to the people.
And altruism, but also, let's say, it would also have created jobs. It would also, there were plans for, an education center, all kinds of affiliated kind of enterprise, right?
So once Fred started buying land in Mpumalanga, he realized that some of his land held clues to the beginnings of life on Earth. And this is no exaggeration. On the land that Fred owned was evidence of the first ocean, evidence of the early atmosphere, evidence of the first tides on Earth, evidence of the first life on Earth, algae and small organisms that later evolved into you and me. All of this was on the land that he bought. And then he discovered that scientists had been coming there for decades to study the story of the history of life. And then under their guidance, he started buying more and more farms surrounding the one that he had initially bought in order to preserve the scientific heritage for all people on Earth. It is amazing.
It sounds, and that was to be the Nkomazi Reserve, and it was going to span, 39,000 hectares?
Yep.
A big project. All right. That's the background for what he wanted to do, and what he was able to do, of course, is quite different. But let's go for a second to David Mabuza. David Mabuza is named in the title of the book. He is on the cover of the book. How much evidence is there that Mabuza was involved in thwarting, not just thwarting Fred's ambitions, but, a coordinated campaign of harassment, victimization, and the rest of it?
Well, there's a huge amount of evidence. So at the time that Fred started really building his game reserve, Didi Mabuza became the MEC for Land Affairs and Agriculture in Mpumalanga. It was his duty and responsibility to be a caretaker of conservation assets. It was his duty and his responsibility to restore land to people who had been denied their land or kicked off their land during apartheid. Fred was very careful when he bought his farms. He checked in every instance whether there were historic land claims on his land. There were none. His land had been in private ownership since long before apartheid, decades before apartheid. And then suddenly, when Didi Mabuza became MEC of Land and Agriculture, new land claims started emerging in the Bud Plus area where Fred had bought his land. Suddenly, there were claimants saying that they had historic claim to this land. Didi Mabuza, as MEC, had enormous powers. He could have used his powers as MEC to provide land to people who were interested in becoming emerging black farmers. But what he did instead was he established a parallel organization called the Greater Bud Plus Land Claims Commission. He was elected chairman of this organization, and the organization's only aim, it seems, was to force white farmers to accept these fake land claims, these fake claims on their land, and also to use millions, tens of millions of rands, 50 million rand especially, that the Land Claims Commission had in its budget to buy land for emerging black farmers, to then enrich white businessmen in the Bud Plus area. It is quite shocking how huge amounts of money intended for emerging black farmers instead was redirected to white businessmen by Didi Mabuza's organization. There's no doubt about it. Didi Mabuza came to a protest that had been organized outside the gates of Fred's game reserve, the Nkomazi Wilderness Reserve. People had been bussed in, had built barricades, were toying, were cutting down Fred's expensive game fences, were threatening to march on his petrol station to petrol bomb it. When Didi Mabuza showed up, gathered the crowd together, stood on the back of the bakkie, picked up a loud hailer and promised the crowd that they would be given Fred's land and told them to disperse. And then they dispersed.
There was a moment also, was there not, when he sort of subtly, but not that subtly, threatened Fred on the phone?
Oh, Fred phoned him to complain. Fred's fences, from the time the Greater Bud Plus Land Claims Committee was established, not only Fred, many other landowners in the Bud Plus region as well, suffered attacks on their land, fences cut down, property destroyed. People were clearly being intimidated into accepting these new claims on their land. None of the claims had merit. Not one of those claims had merit. And I mean, this has been proved by Professor Peter Delius, who is at Wits University, who is one of South Africa's foremost experts on the land claims process.
I've been reminded to tell our audience that if you are wanting to put any questions to Rehana about David Mabuza, about the book Predator Politics, please do so in the chat function and we will get to as many of them as we can. So to summarize so far, we have this guy, Fred Daniel. He's a businessman. He wants to start this kind of amazing sounding, I must say, conservation, education and tourism project in Mpumalanga. And rather than welcome him with open arms, as one would think, I mean, especially in a country where all we're told is we need investment, we need entrepreneurship, blah, blah, blah. Instead of welcoming him with open arms, the provincial government, and it seems with Didi Mabuza at its helm, does everything in their power to thwart his plans, to the point of personally threatening, victimizing, and harassing Fred Daniel. David Mabuza, as we've said, seems to be at the center of this. In the course of your research, what is the impression you formed about Mabuza as a politician, as a person, in terms of the way he does business and politics?
So, Mpumalanga seems to be the province in South Africa where politicians fail upwards. And Didi Mabuza is definitely one of those people who kind of floats to the top. He was MEC for education in the first democratic administration. And then he was fired by Didi Mabuza was fired by Matthews Posa, the first premier in Mpumalanga in democratic South Africa, for faking the matric results. Mpumalanga was not doing very well, education was not doing well, and Didi Mabuza decided as MEC, of Mpumalanga that he would inflate the end of the year matric results. He called education officials to his home and they concocted a matric result. Of course, this was easily found out. Didi Mabuza didn't deny that he did it, and he was dismissed by by Matthew Sposa as MEC. So in his very first position in government, there were indications of the extent of his corruption, and he was dismissed from government. Then, of course, Matthew Sposa was dismissed by government because that's how things work in South Africa, and Didi Mabuza was reappointed after 1995 after 1998 to the provincial government again. And since then, he's moved up the ranks.
And one of his great...
I have to say, can I just say,
of course,
that in his time in the wilderness from the Mpumalanga government, he was sent to the National Assembly. He was sent as an MP to the National Assembly, and he wasn't the only one. I mean, everybody in the first administration, it seems, of Mpumalanga who was fingered for corruption either got sent to the ANC head office for a better position or to the National Assembly. It is shocking.
Yeah, and you reminded me, which I was had forgotten if ever I knew, that Jackson Mthembu, the minister in the presidency, who is these days, I think, broadly considered to be one of the good guys, had his own little corruption skirmish in Mpumalanga back in the day.
Yep, 2. He was one of the first guys who bought a fleet of BMWs for his entire government department. And he said, we are leaders. We can't be seen to be driving 1,600 cars. And then the second one was he then wrote off a luxury car. He didn't have a driver's license. He drove into a tree. He wrote off the car. And the only sanction that he faced was being sent to the National Assembly. Baleka Mbete, a commission of inquiry, found in Mpumalanga that she had she had been given a driver's license without going through the test. She said she was very busy and she couldn't go and have the test. She couldn't stand in lines, she said, because she was an important official. I mean, what happened to her? She became the chairperson of the ANC. They fell upwards in Mpumalanga.
They do. And perhaps one of the reasons why Mabuza was also able to rehabilitate himself so successfully is that he helmed this astonishing growth of the ANC in Mpumalanga when it came to branch numbers, to the point where they get to Nasrec in 2017, and Mpumalanga has the second highest number of branch delegates. What is his secret sauce in that regard?
Well, he says he worked hard. When he was in the wilderness, when he was out of the Mpumalanga government, he went to go and build branches for the ANC. What was so interesting for me when I was looking at these fake land claims, it seems that the Greater Badplaas Land Claims Committee, which was headed by Didi Mabuza, used the same tactics to establish new claimants for land as the ANC did to build branches in Mpumalanga. There have been complaints by senior ANC members in Mpumalanga about membership inflation for decades. Mpumalanga has a tiny population. It doesn't make sense that they have more delegates to an ANC conference than Gauteng has, for instance. So what we found in Mpumalanga, and it's not me, this has been reported by all of our colleagues, Rebecca, for many, many years, is that in Mpumalanga, ANC branches have these members who have similar names, like you'd change the first name or you would change the surname. You've got an ID number and you change a few figures of the ID number to create a new person. You pay bulk membership. You go to an FNB branch, and instead of these new members paying their own ANC membership fees, they paid for in bulk by somebody else. The ANC has had many investigations into membership inflation in Mpumalanga and has agreed that this has indeed happened. The Mpumalanga ANC is currently without any elected leadership because the ANC has decided that there was so much corruption at branch level that, they can't have a provincial government, a provincial leadership.
Yeah. So in late October, October this year, it was announced that fraud charges were being laid against the ANC MP Bongani Bongo, former State Security Minister, and 9 or 10 others in connection with dubious land deals in Mpumalanga from 2011 to 2012. Now, this is unconnected with the events you describe in your book, correct?
This is terrible. So I wrote the book. I had to write the book fast because we had to get it out in time for the court case. This book is about a quarter of what I wrote. Once I started investigating, and because there was so much that was already out in the public and so much that had already been reported by the best journalists in the country, I kind of just wrote it all. I took out Bongani Bongo's corruption because it didn't actually directly affect Fred. I had it in the book. We took it out for space. So there's lots more corruption in Mpumalanga, obviously, than what's contained in my book. There's much, much more corruption involving Didi Mabuza in Mpumalanga than what is contained in my book. I had to try, my publisher did a damn good job. My editor was magnificent in kind of cutting the story down to Fred Daniel and the land scam. Yeah,
one can imagine there is probably untold volumes to be written on this topic. So one of the things your book makes clear is that the whole land reform process is just ripe for abuse. As you said, Fred Daniel was assured in writing there were no land claims related to these farms that he was buying. Then the minute he buys them, suddenly all these claimants pop out of the woodwork saying, no, actually, I have these claims. I mean, what steps could have been taken, can be taken to kind of corruption-proof this process? Because it seems to me that it is by its nature, and given the history of our country, a kind of ambiguous process in terms of who lived where, documentation, etc.
As somebody whose family was a victim of the Group Areas Act, the process has actually worked. I remember as a reporter covering the first land claims in South Africa, and the process was working. People came with documents. Sometimes the document was only a letter from a school principal saying that you had attended a farm school, and that was enough to prove that you were living on the farmer's land. I don't think that there were problems with the process. The problems that we have, and this is the Special Investigating Unit did produce the magnificent report late last year saying that land claims have been hijacked by politicians. There are so many people who work in provincial governments, who work in the Land Claims Commission, who have awarded themselves pieces of land, who have awarded pieces of land to their relatives. It is shocking. There is money for land restitution. There is money even to help emerging black farmers develop their land, to make their land productive. I mean, Didi Mabuza was embroiled in a scandal where one of the last things he did as MEC for Agriculture and Land Affairs in Mpumalanga was to grant a tender for tractors for emerging farmers in Mpumalanga. He used his entire department's budget that year for this tractor deal, which was awarded to a business partner of himself who didn't own one tractor, who did not own one tractor. But the entire department's budget for 3 years went to this company that had no tractors to give tractors to black farmers in Mpumalanga. It is shocking. If I can just say one more thing, what is important to note is that when Fred started developing the Nkomazi Game Reserve in Mpumalanga, he had cooperation from the provincial government. They provided him permits. He did everything by the book. He had to work with the Parks Board in order to get his reserve established. He applied for permits. They granted permits. They inspected his land. They were working very well together until Kerzner International and Butch Kerzner himself came to Fred's land because they were interested in developing a one and only lodge in Mpumalanga. And after Kerzner International inspected Fred's land, they decided to build 2 one and only 7-star lodges on Fred's land. The construction alone of the lodges would have created so much jobs for all of
Yeah.
those miners who had lost their jobs. Then running that job, Fred said, yes, let's do this deal, but I want you to employ locals as often as possible. Fred spoke to all his neighbors who were black farmers who weren't making money off their land, who were interested in bringing down their fences and being part of a reserve for 2 7-star luxury lodges. As soon as that deal got taken to the Mpumalanga Parks Agency and they were told, this is what we are planning to build, that's when they started throwing spanners in the way of Fred's plans. They saw an opportunity for a multi-million rand investment that was going to be made. I think, and I have no proof of this, but when you build up the story, when you look at how they suddenly went from working with Fred to suggesting to Sun International that they cut Fred out of the deal and that they work with them instead to build this investment, that's when the trouble started.
Yeah, it seems very clear that there was an attitude of, you cut us in from the start,
yes,
or there will be no development. You mentioned then, from then the spanners start to accumulate in Fred's works, so to speak. Can you give some examples of the spanners, what form they took?
Well, mostly the biggest one was that Kerzner wanted the big 5. They were going to build luxury 7-star safari lodges. Fred had already introduced certain animals onto his land. He bought them himself. These animals are expensive. We're talking about giraffe. We're talking about rhino. They're very expensive and they need a lot of care. Fred was also using the animals to heal the land. He was building an ecosystem that could look after itself. He was trying to show people that nature has the ability to restore itself. Look at this land. There were asbestos mines here. Within a few years after you have a few hippos in my river, you will see grass where asbestos dust had been before. So he was still waiting for permits for lion. He was still waiting for permits for cheetah. And suddenly the Parks Board that had certified all of his fences, that had certified all of the work that he had done, decided that they weren't going to give him permits for the Big 5, to complete the Big 5. And Sun International said, look, so there are other luxury lodges in Mpumalanga. We need to compete with them. We need the Big 5. Fred has, up until today, not gotten the permits to keep these animals for reasons we don't understand. I mean, they then forced Fred. Fred was finally forced to sell the Nkomazi wilderness because he was getting nowhere. And he sold it to a Dubai-based company. In Mpumalanga, they seem to be very fond of Dubai-based companies. They had tried to sell their assets or give the management of their assets to a Dubai-based company before. So they brought in new people from Dubai, who was the Sultan himself. When Fred sold 50% of the Nkomazi Wilderness Reserve to them, they got granted the permits on the day that they took ownership of Fred's, 50% ownership of Fred's land. The Parks Board tipexed out Fred's name on the application, put the new owner's name on the application, and granted the permits for them to have the Big 5. That's how it happened.
I mean, some of the stuff is so brazen, it's almost amusing, if it weren't so devastating in so many ways. I mean, you say, Rehana, that we don't really understand why, or we don't know why the Parks Board was so slow or unwilling to sort of sign off on the permits for the Big 5. But it is suggested, is it not, that one of the reasons is that they were administering permits for hunting, rather, that it was that they were really interested in.
Fred had no idea. Fred had no idea that this was happening. Fred thought that he was working with a Parks Board that was interested in conserving land and conserving animals. Paul O'Sullivan had been appointed by the Parks Board itself to investigate corruption. The CEO of the board at the time, Charles Ndebeni, was struggling, and he called in Paul O'Sullivan. Paul O'Sullivan spent a couple of weeks in Mpumalanga and discovered that Parks Board officials had set up a separate slush fund and were issuing hunting permits to hunters for animals on Parks Board land, and they were banking the proceeds. They were also slaughtering animals that they were supposed to conserve for all South Africans in order to set up bushmeat butcheries and to establish a biltong factory. The people who were in paid employment, who were earning good salaries to care for these animals, were organizing the hunting of these animals in order to make a buck on the side. It is devastating. And the other shocking thing about some of the best reserves in Mpumalanga is that they acceded to land claims on game reserves. Somgimbelo, one of the most beautiful game reserves in South Africa, has been handed over to land claimants who didn't really show that they had a historical claim to that land. And they are now not caring for the animals and the property at all. Other game reserves in Mpumalanga, we discover, have been transformed into huge dacha plantations. Dacha. And I mean huge, because police go in there and they burn down hectares of dacha. This is what conservation assets are being used for in Mpumalanga at a time of climate change. We must never forget that Fred is incredibly concerned about climate change. We must never forget that Mpumalanga has the worst air quality in the world because of the power stations that have either become too old to continue operating or new ones that are not being built properly because of corruption.
I mean, this is what I mean about how maddening this stuff is. I mean, call me naive, but I thought one of the most shocking revelations in the book was the investigator Paul O'Sullivan's discovery that the parks agency's game rangers were poaching. I mean, it just blows the mind, doesn't it? There's a question here, Rehana, I want to put to you, which was an allegation made against Fred himself, I think. There were some allegations of illegal game breeding or farm activities being conducted on Fred's land. Were these allegations unfounded? That's from Wilhelm Herzog.
Oh, yeah. The Parks Board itself brought charges against Fred to say that Fred was running an animal rehabilitation center without permission on his land. Fred was running an animal rehabilitation on his land. In fact, Fred wasn't running it, but there was an animal rehabilitation center on his land, which had been properly authorized, and the Parks Board swooped in and confiscated the animals, saying that he'd been operating without a permit. They also brought criminal charges against him for operating an animal rehabilitation center without a permit, and then tried to threaten him into withdrawing his applications for Big Five permits, and to plead guilty to these charges of illegally running a rehabilitation center. And of course, if Fred had pled guilty, then he would have been a person who would not be allowed to run a conservation asset in the future, because that's how the law works. So they confiscate his animals. They can't find anywhere to take the animals that they've confiscated. They eventually do. Most of them die while they're being confiscated, including a leopard that Fred had found injured in a trap, had restored to full health in the rehabilitation center, who then mysteriously dies after it was confiscated. And Fred discovers the leopard's carcass. Fred discovers the leopard's carcass is being stuffed somewhere in White River. And the person who is doing the stuffing says that he had been ordered to, or he's been paid to do this by a senior conservation official. So Fred's leopard has now become a trophy for a conservation official. So the court says, there's no grounds for this prosecution. Fred's animals must be returned, but then his most valuable animal ends up as a trophy. It's shocking. They've brought many, many charges. I'd also like to say that Fred has this 1 billion rand court case against government departments and Didi Mabuza. He has, over the past few years, over the past 15 years, brought more than 20 cases against government officials, conservation officials, and has been successful in every single instance. There was one where he bought a protection order against Didi Mabuza, where the magistrates, after he granted the protection order, was moved to another court, and a new magistrate came in and decided that he couldn't find the record, and then he withdrew the order. But he never found that Fred wasn't entitled to the order. Fred has won so many court cases. They've never been able to make anything stick.
That was the question being asked by Mike Morgan, I think, that has there been a move to lay charges against David Mabuza? I mean, as you've said, abundantly by Fred Daniel, but the status of so he currently has a, R1 billion damages claim against the Mpumalanga government that was supposed to be heard this year.
Yes, it was set down for July and August. It's a special case granted by the North Gauteng High Court. A special trial is hard to get. You have to persuade the court that there are grounds for this. You have to persuade the court that they have to set aside substantial time to hear your case. And the North Gauteng court then set down a special trial for Fred for 3 weeks from July into August this year. Didi Mabuza's lawyer, Mike Helens, SC, who has represented so many people who have been fingered in state capture, came to the North Gauteng High Court with all kinds of spurious grounds to attack Fred's case, including like Fred had to produce his ID book to show that he was indeed Fred Daniel. All kinds of spurious technical issues, that they weren't ready to defend themselves because of all these technical issues. And so the case never happened. The North Gauteng High Court has now provided Fred with a new date. The case will be heard in 2021. Let's see what Mike Helens does, but it's set down again for June next year.
It really is amazing how you see the same names crop up again and again when it comes to legal defense for these characters. Muzi Sikana is another one. I think it's important, unfortunately, Rehana, to make the point that, there's this racist trope that Black South Africans don't care about conservation or the environment. But, the book makes it very, very clear that those involved in this corruption are not just Black politicians, that it is Black politicians, certainly, but being very ably enabled by white private sector people and even farmers as well.
I'm not so sure. When I read about pollution in Mpumalanga, the people who are hurt the most by pollution are the poor people who live next to these faulty power stations. We're talking about asthma, we're talking about lung disease. I mean, even people who mine coal in Mpumalanga know how dangerous pollution is. I don't think it's a white thing at all. I think, it is a luxury sometimes to spend time in a game reserve. I think because of apartheid, I grew up without game reserves. I wasn't allowed into the state-owned game reserves. They were whites only. Or if I was allowed, it was on a certain day and I couldn't sleep over. So I didn't grow up with it, but it doesn't mean that I don't care. But when I think when it comes to pollution, and I think pollution, especially in Mpumalanga, it is poor Black people who are dying of lung disease, not the rich white visitors to the Kruger Park. They're not so affected by pollution. So I look at the work that Greenpeace has done in Mpumalanga, and all of their research is, the lung diseases among poor Black people.
Yeah, sorry, let me restate my question. My question was just that it may be tempting for some people to look at the story and say, oh, it's Black politicians who don't care about the environment. But the book makes it clear that there are white private sector people and farmers as well who are also complicit in the land scam, in this corruption that is happening in Mpumalanga.
Oh, yes. This is the shocking thing. So this Fred blew the whistle twice on land scams in Mpumalanga, twice. So he's a whistleblower, and of course, you know what happens to whistleblowers in South Africa. They don't have an easy time of it. And the first land scam that he blew the whistle on, he discovered that the beneficial use of the farms that the Land Claims Commissioner was supposedly buying for poor Black farmers in Mpumalanga, the use of the farms went to white farmers in the area. So you have this white farmer in Mpumalanga who takes out options to buy his neighbor's farms, ostensibly for land claimants in Mpumalanga. His name is Jan Fasahi. And Fasahi ends up with like couple of 100 hectares of gorgeous land in Mpumalanga that he rents out. He rents from the land claimants for 7,000 rand a month, and then rents out to McCain's for 25,000 rand a month or more to grow vegetables on it. So, and we had white businessmen in Mpumalanga who were grazing large herds of cattle on conservation assets and on land claimants' land. So the land claimants are sitting there as poor as they've ever been, and you've got this white businessmen in Mpumalanga who are getting rich. It's shocking.
It truly is. Martin Bagel says, listening to this, I think I'm going to fall on my sword. I feel the same way, Martin, to be quite honest. Tara Jandral saying, you're amazing, Rehana. Thank you for exposing all this. Let's hope something positive comes out of it. Andre Groenewold making an interesting point. If Fred wins the case, won't it be the taxpayers who are ultimately footing that bill?
That is a very important question. Fred is not at all interested in the quantum of his damages claim. He has to quantify it, right? He has to quantify it for the court. He's claiming damages. His lawyers have to say to the court, this is how much I'm claiming. So we're talking about two one and only resorts. I don't know if people know the one and only, but the one and only is a big deal around the world. So we're talking about two that would have been built on his land. Besides all the other investments and investors who have pulled out along the way when the provincial government said we're not working with Fred Daniel any longer, and they started smearing Fred Daniel. So quantifiably, Fred has lost more than 1 million rand in damages. When he was limping towards his court case last year in the face of Mike Hallen's intransigence, Fred's lawyers told the court in no uncertain terms, in writing, we're not really interested in the damages. We want to restore relationships with the government in Mpumalanga to see whether there's a chance that this project will ever get off the ground. So Fred offered to split the damages case and the quantum into two trials. He asked the North Gauteng High Court, please, can we just deal with the relationships that have broken down as a result of this corruption? The court agreed and has now split the trial into two, so that next year, when Fred goes to court, the issue of damages is not hanging over these cases. He's not asking for a cent. He's asking for the court to hear what happened to him and to determine whether or not he is a victim of corruption-related harassment. The harassment he faced was so severe after he blew the whistle on land scams in the province.
That he ended up leaving the province, in fact, correct?
He ended up leaving the province. Look, Fred's not the only one who faced harassment and victimization as a result of these corrupt land claims. His neighbors faced as much victimization. I took it out of the book again because of lack of space, but there is an affidavit by a policeman in the Badplaas police station who kind of says, you know, this wasn't only happening to Fred. We've had arson attacks, we've had shootings, we've had people chased off their land, we've had people invade poor black farmers' land as well. This didn't only happen to Fred. It happened to everybody who stood in the way of land claims corruption in Mpumalanga. But Fred had to leave. You know, the thing that really hurts me is Fred has a son who is the same age as my grandson. And so I can't help but compare the development of my grandson to his son. Fred's son has lost 2 years of schooling as a result of harassment. The child was too scared to sleep in his bed. The child, I mean, I spoke to him and he wants to know, you know, are these bad guys coming to hurt them again? Fred faced assassination attempts. He's not the only one in Mpumalanga. There's a long litany of assassinations of whistleblowers in my book, and Fred was advised to leave the province for his own emotional health and the safety of his family.
What about your safety? I mean, did you have concerns while writing the book? Have you had concerns post-publication?
I didn't have concerns until everybody started asking me, aren't you scared of assassination? And then I started being a little bit worried. But I mean, you know, if they assassinate me, I'm sure my book will sell more copies. So that's good for whoever's going to inherit from me. No, but, however, one of the tactics that are used in Mpumalanga by corrupt politicians is the politics of smear. They are so good at smearing. I mean, their smear campaign against Fred is, wow. I mean, what a good one. they nearly had him. I'm going to save that for the readers. They have to buy the book to discover that. But since my book has been published, in fact, a week before my book was published, the Star started publishing stories attacking the book. The first one was, this book is about to be published, and Didi Mabuza wasn't approached for comment on the book, and he doesn't really understand why the book's about him, but he hasn't been asked to comment in the book. Since the book's come out, of course, there's been no complaints. The Didi Mabuza side of the story, as poor as it is not contained in the book. Then the Star had a second story in the headline. They suddenly said the Didi Mabuza saga had amplified, I don't know, some stupid story. And then on Monday, they had the story, the weirdest. I mean, actually, I think maybe my next fiction book will be there, about some man who's going to court because he thinks that women cause gender-based violence, and he's going to get an interdict against his wife because she drove him to gender-based violence. And then this man, who I've never met ever in my life, has been the source on my book. He was the person I collaborated with for my book. And then the book, the Star says, is written by Rehana Rossouw. So I thought at first, okay, it has nothing to do with me. But then they got the name Predator Politics, right? So they all link me to the smear. But the most egregious thing, and if you will allow me, I would like to read one sentence from the Star's article on Monday. The final sentence of the article reads, "The court recently found that Daniel abused the judicial process in an attempt to obfuscate his own illegal activities." So, I mean, that is an out and out lie. First, name the court, if any court has found this, to say the court recently found. And to obfuscate his own illegal activities, and then you don't mention what those illegal activities are. And then, of course, the sad thing is that these articles are written by a staff reporter. So Fred and I can't just find out who that person is. Yeah. For all we know, it might be Iqbal Survey himself. It does seem to have been written by somebody who has no training as a journalist, so maybe it is Iqbal himself. And if it is Iqbal himself, then all I want to do is ask Iqbal, what have I ever done to you? What have I ever done to you? I know you since you were a small child. I've never done anything to hurt you. Why are you doing this to Fred Daniel? Either put a name on the story, or I'm going to hold Iqbal Survey responsible. Staff report doesn't cut it when you publish lies. I mean, I feel like I'm living in bloody Trump land.
Absolutely. There's an interesting observation here from Jacques Joubert. Not a depressing story, actually. It's the story about a heroic South African and his family standing their ground. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Fred Daniel is one of the most determined people I have ever met. I also interview other people involved in tourism and conservation in Mpumalanga. Many have been driven out of the province by the harassment, by the corruption. Fred is standing his ground. Standing his ground is Fred's words. He's not giving up. He's not going away. He's going to fight this to the bitter end. And I think he's right to do so.
I think he's right too, but I must say a lesser person, myself included, would definitely have caved by now in the face of this kind of harassment. I think Sipapelo Dlamini has the question that everyone wants to know, which is, how do we save our country? How do we save our country from this kind of behavior, from this kind of corruption?
Stand up. Fred stood up at great cost to himself financially, at great cost to himself emotionally. He stood up. The Zondo Commission is doing a wonderful job. We start every day in my household with the Zondo Commission. We listen, we watch all day long. There is a good job being done. The SIU report on land claims corruption is wonderful. Somebody has to act on it. The new NPA is getting onto its feet. I do, for the first time, feel that there's hope that people will be prosecuted for this gross acts of corruption. We have to fight back. Either we fight back or we drive ourselves into the sea. I don't know what else we're supposed to do. This is our land. It's not their land, it's ours.
Do you have any, I mean, you say for the first time you have confidence that people may get prosecuted. I agree. We've heard persistent mutterings as well that David Mabuza himself may be in the firing line. Do you have any hope or any expectation that this book may do anything in terms of his standing within the ANC? I mean, we saw that fantastic piece of investigative journalism. You're already laughing. Fantastic piece of investigative journalism published by the New York Times in August 2018, which laid out a lot of the damaging accusations against Mabuza. It clearly did nothing in terms of, he's still deputy president. Could it be different this time?
No, not with this ANC, not with this ANC leadership. It doesn't mean that this ANC has to suffer through this kind of leadership forever. I do believe there are good people in the ANC. I do believe that if the ANC can get around this problem of membership inflation and bringing, fraudulent and fake people to their conferences to elect people like Didi Mabuza, there are simple steps that the party can take to ensure that they have clean leadership. They haven't had the political will to do that. Good people could join the ANC. Good people could start another political organization. The ANC doesn't need to be the be-all and end-all of liberation. We have given them enough time to liberate the people of South Africa. They have shown that they're not interested in liberating the people of South Africa. They're interested in buying gold Bentleys and Lamborghinis and Ferraris and, mansions all over the country. I'm obsessed as well at the moment by Donald Trump. Good people can stand up and say, enough is enough. We can do that here as well.
The irony, of course, is that were it not for David Mabuza's support at Nasrec, were it not for David Mabuza instructing his Mpumalanga delegates to vote for Cyril Ramaphosa, we would not have Ramaphosa as president. And presumably we wouldn't have this somewhat strengthened NPA.
Yes, but, my book deals with impunity. If you and I, Rebecca, as citizens of this country, commit a crime, we would expect a knock on our door. In Mpumalanga, for decades, politicians have gone from small crimes to multi-million rand crimes, and they've never had a knock on their door. This is the kind of impunity that happened during the Jacob Zuma presidency. We don't need to say that it's going to continue because Jacob Zuma set it up that way. We can end it.
Absolutely. All right, I think it just remains for me to thank very much, Rehana Rossouw, who is the author of Predator Politics. It's available on the Daily Maverick's website as well as at all good bookshops. I think you can still get away if you click the link in the chat box. You can still get away with a 290 Rand copy delivered for free to anywhere in South Africa. Rehana Rossouw, I should say, is also the most fantastic writer of fiction. You'll see, probably if you have eagle eyes, several of her books on my bookshelf behind me. Thank you once again, Rehana, and thank you for the work you are doing to help expose this kind of nonsense.
Thank you, Rebecca. You are too, by hosting this webinar, helping to expose this nonsense. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to our listeners, to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for sponsoring the discussion, and to Maverick Insiders. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you.